For once, I'm without words in this place, Mr. Speaker. I don't know. We should probably rise after that eloquent advice and address from the member from Scarborough Agincourt, but I know he would want our parliamentary democracy and the wheels to continue on that. And I would remind him in a friendly way that I was very much correct, Mr. Speaker, when I was in Vulcan. And I should add that I'm splitting my time with the honourable member from Brandon Souris. I was right in Vulcan, Alberta, Mr. Speaker. With the current plan of the Liberal government, high taxes, high deficit, high debt, a war on resource-based jobs that are considered second-class, Mr. Speaker, it would look like we're not en route to live long and prosper, as I joked with my friend from Scarborough Agincourt at that day in Vulcan. And really that underpins why we're debating this today, a very cogent motion from my good friend, the MP for Selkirk Interlake Eastman, with a list of issues that show that how in a year and a half, Mr. Speaker, our economy has been set back. You know, in many ways, the phrase Canada is back now means back into deficit, back into debt, back into higher Liberal taxes, back into cutting the military, although suggesting at some magical point in the future they will put more money into it. So the member from Selkirk Interlake Eastman has put in a number of items that we should be mindful of as we debate the economy. The first really is the deficit, Mr. Speaker, because we know when a government runs a deficit, that means one of two things. Either they will have to cut spending at some point in the future, cut programs, or they will have to raise taxes. So many economists actually look at deficits as deferred taxes, Mr. Speaker. And we remember the Prime Minister, when he was third-party leader, promised Canadians, Canada's in a recession, we need infrastructure jobs, so I'm going to run a modest deficit never to exceed $10 billion, Mr. Speaker. We know he broke that promise within 3 months of becoming Prime Minister. In fact, the Liberal government could only dream of deficits in the $10 billion range, Mr. Speaker. Their last budget tabled a $28.5 billion deficit, while at the same time, Mr. Speaker, raising taxes. So not only is that deficit a sign that there's more tax increases to come, the Liberal government set on an unparalleled course of raising taxes on families, on seniors by reducing the TFSA eligibility, on employers through the CPP payroll tax, through rolling back the planned reduction to small business, and now with a nationalized carbon tax. They have literally taxed every group and mode of economic activity, Mr. Speaker. And as we joked recently, with their Saturday night budget tax, they're taxing beer, wine, and your Uber ride home, Mr. Speaker. So the so-called sharing economy, they're even taxing sharing, Mr. Speaker. So that, I guess, is sunny ways. Broken promises on the deficit and taxes as far as the eye can see, of all flavors and stripes, Mr. Speaker. I'd remind the Minister for Public Safety, who was here for many, many years, Mr. Speaker, when he was criticizing the last government, he said this, I quote, "Does the minister take satisfaction in that debt number? Why, in arriving in that sorry position, did this government put our country into deficit again, before the recession occurred? It was not because of the recession, it was before the recession. That is when they blew the fiscal framework, Mr. Speaker," unquote. Well, despite the third-party leaders' claims at the time during the 2015 election, there was no recession, Mr. Speaker. There was no need to even run a modest $10 billion deficit. Yet, with their reckless spending, they're running $28.5 billion in deficit, with no discernible impact on jobs from infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, and with capital in the resource economy, in manufacturing. We saw Procter & Gamble just a few weeks ago from Brockville fleeing this country because of the high tax, high regulatory regime. It's really an astounding record, and that's why my friend from Selkirk Interlake Eastman brought this to the floor of the House of Commons. The most important issue facing a family is whether there's a job for mom and dad if they want to work. Do they have that opportunity? Well, they don't with this government that sets out to have classes of jobs, Mr. Speaker. IT and technology jobs seem to be acceptable to this government. Yet resource-based jobs or jobs in softwood or in the fishing economy in Atlantic Canada seem somehow secondary to these cluster-based concepts they're going after. And nothing shows this more than the most recent addition to our cabinet, Mr. Speaker, the member from Burlington, who just before politics, suggested we should close the oil sands, Mr. Speaker. A comment that even the Prime Minister has let slip out from time to time, Mr. Speaker. The single largest contributor to our GDP, to our economy, to healthcare, to the programs we have, they feel should just be closed like a turnkey solution, and maybe those people can get jobs in the so-called infrastructure bank, or these office towers of bureaucrats that the government is hiring. Or maybe they can look into the 147 programs on innovation that this government has to find a job that is acceptable to this government. Because clearly getting your hands dirty and bringing product out of the ground, getting royalties for Canadians, seems somehow secondary to this government. Mr. Speaker, I sat in this House when President Obama addressed us. And the Prime Minister embarrassed us that day when he said, "You're here to see a bromance in action." For a Prime Minister to say that in this chamber introducing the President of the United States, I was frankly embarrassed, Mr. Speaker. But what did that bromance get us? Nothing. President Obama canceled Keystone. He would not finalize the softwood lumber agreement with his bromance diplomacy pal. He would not give us a good border deal. Bill C-23 gives the Americans a lot of benefit on Canadian soil and gave us nothing. Wouldn't even remove the marijuana question from the pre-clearance screening to go into the United States at a time the government is legalizing marijuana, Mr. Speaker. It was a one-way deal. The Americans got everything, and the Liberal government, I guess, got a state dinner with seats for family and friends. That's not a win, Mr. Speaker. That's not negotiating in our interest. As my colleague from Selkirk Interlake Eastman reminded this House, it was the Conservative government that negotiated a deal on softwood that gave certainty to 1,100 workers who are now likely going to lose their job in the next few months, the $300 million plus in economic activity lost. They've gone nowhere, even when they had this bromance with President Obama. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope when the Prime Minister had dinner in Montreal last week, I at least hope Mr. Obama picked up the check. Because literally we've got nothing from this government when it comes to the American relationship, an important one. And now this government, with their motions on the fly, making up foreign policy on the fly, making up defense policy on the fly, they seem to think their job is to be the global opposition leader to President Trump. Their job is actually to help Canada. Their job is actually to bring jobs for families in Western Canada, in Southern Ontario, in Atlantic Canada, in our north. The Prime Minister's been all around the world, but he hasn't been to Yukon, Mr. Speaker. That's an embarrassment. Resource jobs in our north, in Western Canada, seem second class with this government. And I like to say how proud I was. My first real job as a young person was working for TransCanada Pipeline, Mr. Speaker, inspecting the pipeline that runs through the Belleville to Ottawa area, the safest way to transit our resources to market, Mr. Speaker. Yet with this government, they will pull an issue before they determine what's in our country's best interest. They will ask foreign leaders what they should do. They will give our money to other countries' green programs while our resource economy is hurting. Mr. Speaker, I'll end with this. When I was in Calgary months ago, I was in line at McDonald's for a coffee, and a mother behind us said to her sons, you'll have to change your order because mommy lost her job, and we're going to have some changes. There's been thousands of stories like that, Mr. Speaker, in Alberta, and they've heard nothing from this government. In fact, with their antithetical approach to our U.S. ally, we're going to increasingly be talking about multilateralism, but we're going to be closed off from economic opportunity, trade, security and defence opportunity, Mr. Speaker. So this motion is reminding Canadians that the failures of this government on the economy are profound, and we need to turn it around.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I listened intently there from the honourable member from Durham. And I would like to ask the honourable member what his thoughts are on the jobs numbers that came out on Friday, where Canada created 77,000 new full-time jobs from coast to coast to coast, and the economy's grown at above a 2% rate, something that I don't think in the past 10 years was even reached by the prior government in power. So I'd like to get his comments on the job growth that we've seen for the last 6 months across Canada, the unemployment rate that's gone down, and the general optimistic nature that Canadians have on the economy going forward in the future for their kids, and the key strategic investments that we're undertaking as a government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Durham.
I'd like to thank the honourable member from Vaughan Woodbridge, Mr. Speaker, for his statistical rundown. There have been some jobs, and I am happy about that. The full impact of the Liberal government's actions aren't being felt. In fact, the carbon tax or the carbon scheme across the country is really just being felt. We're seeing estimates well above 10 cents additional price for fuel, Mr. Speaker. It will take some larger contracts. It will take some period of time before industry accepts this new regime. We're also seeing the CPP, payroll tax and other things taking time to take effect. I'd remind that member that the auto parts industry across Southern Ontario, including in Vaughan, some great jobs, they are worried, Mr. Speaker, because we have an integrated North American economy. And they are going to either be moving their location from Vaughan or losing contracts in a North American integrated economy because there is no input cost for carbon in the U.S., and there is here. Yet again, another thing Mr. Obama praised this government on, yet you didn't see Mr. Obama imposing a carbon tax. We are allowing our economy to become uncompetitive 1 month at a time, and we may see a little pop-up now, but when the full impact of this high tax regime is in place, we will have no manufacturing business left in Vaughan or across Southern Ontario.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Regina Leuven.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to pick up on that last question about the latest job numbers, because I was struck by the fact that Statistics Canada's website was down almost that whole day. And Mr. Speaker, that wasn't an isolated incident. We had the chief statistician, the former chief statistician, Wayne Smith, resign in protest of the lack of IT support that Statistics Canada was getting from shared services. So I wonder if the member for Durham has any comment on the state of Statistics Canada and whether this government is providing enough support to this agency so that we as parliamentarians and Canadians have the data to properly evaluate what's happening in our country's economy. Thank you.
The honourable member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member from Regina for highlighting a very interesting point. You know, the resignation of Mr. Smith from Stats Canada highlights something that this government does very well. It talks the sunny ways game, but secretly, it's the most partisan. You know, its House leader has been setting records in the use of closure, Mr. Speaker. And had there been a resignation of this level from Statistics Canada under the Conservative government, the howls of outrage were across this nation, Mr. Speaker. You know, nothing highlights it better than actually votes on a